Morning, everybody. My name is Paul Bockelman, Solutions Architect with our public sector. Here to talk about VMware Cloud on AWS. This is an announcement that we made, a joint announcement that was made last October. Since then, we've had significant amount of customer interest. There's been a lot of uptick in activity around this announcement, and we're pretty excited about where the product's going. So I'm going to take you guys through today, kind of revisit what we're talking about. When we, as in VMware and AWS, when we're talking hybrid IT, what are we really talking about? I want to re-baseline that. And then I'm going to get into a bit of the product details and then drive and drill down into the technical components. So this isn't an AWS conference, so we want to talk about some of the AWS pieces that are fueling this solution so that you guys can understand how we can operate this as an integrated solution. So if we take a look at revisiting hybrid, I always told myself, I was in consulting for years, and I always said I would never be the cloud guy that would show up with a NIST slide for defining cloud computing, and well, here I am. So, but I have a good reason for it. So I just wanted to baseline. So when we're talking about the different cloud models, when you talk about private cloud, typically solely for an organization, can run on-prem or off-prem, but it's usually operated specifically for a single organization. So VMware has played a very huge role in that space for a long time and will continue to do so. When you look at public cloud infrastructure, it's available to anyone. Anybody with a credit card can buy public cloud infrastructure. It's owned by a third party, and it can, it can exist in a couple different formats. And so then when we get into the community cloud, when we look at what both AWS and VMware has done on this space, I think we have a fairly significant footprint with community cloud. So you have organizations with common requirements, whether they're compliance, security, or otherwise, grouped together. VMware has definitely been playing that space, particularly if we look in our defense organizations and other agencies. And then if you look at, some people who argue what AWS has done with GovCloud and with some other contracts, we have this type of arrangement already in place. So when we look at hybrid, we're taking two or more of those other types of clouds and we're mixing them together. But the key here is that they're bound together through a standardized technology or approach. And so with IT evolving as it has been over the years, there's been, been kind of like a little bit of a stalemate, right? Well, it's like you have this cloud infrastructure, you've got private cloud, you've got public cloud. Why aren't we just, bolting these things together and being off at the races? So a little bit about that. But first, why do customers really want, hybrid IT? Well, they want to run, and they're still going to continue to run workloads on premise. So the fact that AWS has customers that are going all in on AWS doesn't negate the fact that there's still going to need to be infrastructure that's run locally. When we look at customers are also want to move a lot of these workloads into the cloud. So while they're continuing to have a presence on site, they want to be able to have elasticity in their infrastructure. They want to forego buying new equipment, but they want to move into the cloud. Or perhaps they're being mandated. There's a lot of cloud-first policies that are being inked out there. And so customers are feeling the pressure to move into the cloud. So if they're going to do this, they want tight integration between the two. They don't want them to be two disjointed networks or two disjointed operating capabilities that don't seem to work very well together. And then they want to do this without buying new hardware. And so we have the solution. So what are some of the adoption barriers? Why isn't this happening just on a mass scale, right? So when you think about it, looking at AWS versus VMware or vice versa, you're still dealing with multiple machine formats. So it's a barrier for adoption for a lot of organizations, because at some point, if you want to move a workload from one location to another, whether it's from private to public or public to private, you have to deal with a machine conversion issue. You're going to have to take some time, some downtime, or use third-party tools. We have quite a robust ecosystem of partners that really make this conversion process a lot more seamless, a lot less painless, but it's not as seamless and painless as everybody still wants it to be. And so when we look at the networks, they still feel a little incongruent. So if you're operating your VMware network on premise and then you have your VPC and everything that you're operating in AWS. While you can connect them through a bunch of different connectivity options, it still feels a little incongruent because you can't quite move the workloads necessarily. You can move the packets, you can move the data, but you can't necessarily move the processing as seamless as folks would like to be able to do. And then you get operational inconsistency. So now you have an operations organization that has to operate two different types of data centers, if you would. You have your VMware environment that they're operating, and then now they're tooling up and operating the AWS world. That brings in a new set of problems. Well, you likely have to learn some new skills, bring in some new tools into the environment. When you look at some of the operating softwares or different packages that you can use to do a hybrid cloud or a multi-cloud type operations management solution, there's going to be gaps, right? You're going to have leopard spots even in those solutions, so you're still feeling like you have to bring in a second or third tool to actually operate your environment. And then when you get into the control mechanisms, particularly for this audience, as you start getting into the security and control and operations of the environment, you may have two different sets of baselines that you're dealing with. And so that tends to be a barrier. Folks are like, you know, my job's hard enough as it is. Why do I want to introduce this new technology and now I have to do this new set of tasks? And so we're hoping that the product, VMware Cloud on AWS, will significantly ease that burden and adoption because at its core, it is VMware. VMware like you're running in your data centers today, it's just running on AWS global infrastructure. And so if we look at the product overview on this, there's three core components to this package. There is vSphere, vSAN, and NSX. Those are the three core VMware components that make up this package. So as a customer, a couple key thoughts or key points to make about this. One, this is not a product that AWS sells. This is a VMware product. So you'll be engaging with VMware and VMware sales teams to actually purchase the product. So that's a key takeaway. Second key takeaway is that you're running ESX here. You're not running nested virtualization. That's a key note. This is not nested virtualization. And so you'll have the latest software, the latest vSphere, vSAN, and NSX software that will be stood up, provisioned, and operated on your behalf as a customer, as a service that you'll consume directly from VMware. That will just be running on AWS's global infrastructure. So connecting it back to your data center, connecting it back to your infrastructure. The goal here, vCenter is vCenter, and it's going to continue to operate as you know it today. There'll be enhancements, operating in linked mode, be able to manage multiple sites. At the end of the day, what you have here, if you launch an environment in VMware Cloud on AWS, essentially when you're looking at it in your vSphere ecosystem, is you have a new site, a new data center, a new set of clusters. You have more resources, but it's still the operating environment that you know and operate today. So tools like vRealize, Power CLI, those tools still are usable. You can still apply them to this environment. Again, it's another data center. It's another ecosystem that you can run on top and communicate with. And then when you look at the AWS infrastructure, because it is on AWS infrastructure and the way that we are deploying it, more about that in a bit, you have access to the native AWS services that are running in the same region is where you deploy this environment. And again, CloudFormation, Power CLI, SDKs, all of that still applies. So if you think back to the NIST slide that I did just previously, one of the keys on the hybrid piece of it was you're using standard technologies, standard capabilities. Nothing here that we're introducing is really anything new to either customers of AWS and or VMware. And so if we take a view of this as an AWS operator, what's happening inside of AWS when this account gets launched? So a couple different things. As part of the provisioning process, a new customer account that is owned and operated by VMware on behalf of the customer is created so it's operated in a single tenant format. So you won't be sharing any host infrastructure or any of your network resources with any other customer. It's all single tenant within a single account. As part of the provisioning process, ESX nodes will be stood up through an automated flash provisioning process. Those again are running on bare metal, running the ESX directly on EC2 hardware. And then all of the other components necessary to get a new VMware data center up and running in the cloud will be pre-provisioned and brought to a baseline to where you can begin to consume it. And so some of, from a different, if you look at it from an AWS point of view, you're unlocking things like dynamic capacity or the ability to add capacity very quickly, things like that. The elasticity still remains. The difference is you're working that through API front ends and operating it through a VMware portal as opposed to directly through an AWS API. And so the goal here is once an environment is provisioned, you'll start out with at least a single cluster, a single 4-node cluster, an ESX node cluster, and I'll get into the specifics on that sizing. But you have now the ability, once the environment is stood up, to now interconnect it with your environments or interconnect it with other cloud environments. And so if we look at the integration, we talked about it. Because it's on AWS's global infrastructure, it's launched into a region, all of the resources that are available in that region can be made available to your workloads, your VMware workloads that are running alongside of them. And so one of the things that we're doing differently for this that we do with any typical partner solution that is launched on the AWS is that we're enabling the plumbing, the behind-the-scenes plumbing that enables the seamless integration between that VMware operating environment and AWS. And I think it'll become pretty clear here in a bit. The difference is this is not meant to be disjointed, right? It's not, oh, I'm just happen to be running at 2 data centers that happen to be co-located in AWS, so let me see if I can get some things to talk to one another, use GRE tunnels or VPN tunnels and things like that to get that interconnectivity to happen. We don't want that. We want to break down all those barriers and make this a seamless integration. From an operations and support perspective, this is a solution that you're purchasing directly from VMware. So you'll work with your VMware account teams and any of the enterprise agreements or solutions or support agreements that you have in place with them. Those are the ones that you'll work with VMware on that. So what does that mean if you have a problem, right? You have a trouble ticket. You run that trouble ticket directly through VMware. So even though it's running on AWS infrastructure, and you know that it's running on AWS infrastructure, if at some point you feel that you have been able to diagnose that you're having a problem in your cluster, and you think it's an AWS node, you work with VMware, VMware will work directly with AWS. We'll get this problem resolved for you, and the capacity that you subscribe to will be made available to you and be brought back online for you. So very simple support path. Again, from a networking perspective, we really want this to be a seamless integration. Same thing from a support perspective. Customers shouldn't have to figure out who do I call to get this thing fixed. So a couple different use cases and scenarios. Why would I want to do this, right? So first scenario you think about it is you have an existing VMware footprint, but you're looking to expand, have geo expansion. Perhaps you need to move into new areas for expansion of business type things or expansion of operations, or perhaps maybe you need temporary capacity in a separate geography and you don't want to go and build the infrastructure or buy the infrastructure, you just need it temporarily. So geo expansion and DR Coop are very big plays here. DR Coop kind of takes a different dimension though, right? So when you think about DR Coop in a traditional VMware sense and you're thinking about things like SRM, that's not what we're talking about here. At least not yet, right? If you have this environment stood up and operating, you have the ability to move workloads between your different locations. The goal here would be to have that be seamlessly, but it starts to change the conversation a little bit when you get into your DR and COOP conversations. We look at scenario 2 is data center consolidation. Perhaps you've got a directive, you've got to evacuate data centers, you've got to close things down, you've got to reduce the number of facilities that you have. And doing so doesn't always happen seamlessly, right? The reason why you probably have multiple facilities is because there's that build out, and in order to consolidate them, you're going to have to probably build whatever your consolidation facility is. That target facility is going to be a significant capital investment. And so to forego that investment, this is a good opportunity for you to look at just moving the workloads into an infrastructure that's already running on AWS. You still use your same tools, you still use your same VMs, and you still use your same networks and operations. The difference is Instead of buying new racks and servers and cages and upgrading facilities, you're now moving them into the AWS environment. And we look at our third scenario, production dev test training. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. You need to have the ability to train your folks. You want to have a walled garden for development test. There's a whole multitude of different scenarios that you can stand up here. And then burst capacity. So if you've got periodic spikes in your workloads that you know about and you want to be proactive about them, this is a good way for you to offload a lot of that high, perhaps it could be high bandwidth, perhaps it could be just high load type of spiky demand or planned demand, move it off to a different infrastructure. Now, when you decide to actually purchase this solution, you don't need to go to VMware and say, I need to get 2 units of scenario 2 and 1 unit of scenario 3. It's not like that, right? This is just a way for you to think about how the operating environment works. So like with scenario 3 as an example, you could have the environment up and running and you can just flex your workloads over there as you need to, if that's what you need, right? Doesn't require, if you stand it up and you say this is our DR solution to begin with, and then eventually you start moving into more of a production mode, that's your decision to make. You're fully in control of the environment. You are the customer, the owner and operator of the environment and the data that's within it, so you're fully within your rights to make that design decision. And so I talked about a couple of different accounts, and I realized that I need to make an update to this slide. So when I talk about this, there's usually 2 accounts I talk about. There should be actually 3 accounts. The first account I talk about is a VMware Cloud VPC account. Now this is an AWS account that VMware stands up on behalf of you, the customer, when you go in and subscribe to the service. But you cannot subscribe to the service if you don't actually have the real first account, which is a VMware account through the VMC portal. So if you're an existing VMware customer or you sign up as a VMware customer, you get an account directly with VMware that allows you access to the portal for subscribing to this service. It allows you to decide what packages you're going to buy, how you're going to pay for it, things like that. So that account actually needs to pre-exist. Once that occurs, you can go through the subscription process, and a VMware account will be stood up. It's an AWS account that's running the VMware infrastructure inside of it. And so it's a new solution account for every customer. Remember, this is single tenant. It's a single tenant solution, both at the account level, the network level, and at the host level. The key thing here is even though it's on AWS, all of the AWS resources that are used to deliver this account is paid for directly by VMware. You don't get a bill from AWS for, oh, well, these are your 4 EC2 instances that you're running the VMware Cloud. No, you have a single bill from VMware for everything that's inside of this account. And again, it's single tenant. We talked about that. Now, VMware will link this into their master biller. If you guys are familiar with consolidated billing, VMware at this point is a customer. They're going to take advantage of the same economies of scale and the master linkage relationship that we have today. And so when we look at the next account, is an AWS customer account. So this is just, it could be an existing account that you may have today. If you're an existing AWS customer, you have existing workloads out there running, literally you can just point the provisioning process towards that account and actually have the provisioning happen within your customer account without having to create a new one. Or optionally, you could have a new one created that's dedicated for this purpose. But the key thing here to take away with this is that this is an account that is a full AWS account, which means every native AWS service that is in that account, you have the ability to use and operate and build things the way you normally would, irrespective of VMware being part of the solution. So as a result, you as a customer, you have financial responsibility for that account as well. And so that does not roll up underneath the VMware account. Now, why this demarc, right? It seems like it can be a bit of a challenge when you start getting into how do we pay the bills, and I recognize that. We created a line of demarcation, particularly when you start getting into workloads that need to be certified. You're going to be running compliant workloads and things like that. We have to be able to articulate and clearly demonstrate where the customer's responsibility may begin and end. Because remember, on the VMware side of the accounts, they're operating the environment on your behalf. So as a platform as a service, if you would, right? And so there's a set of controls and operating mechanisms that VMware is responsible for that fall within that account. As a customer, you can make other design decisions that don't have any bearing on what's happening in that separate account, and you know, as you start getting into things like ATOs and certifications, you have that responsibility as well. So we wanted to make sure from, you know, that's a key driver between the separation in these accounts. Another, you know, driver for separation of the accounts is, let's say you decide you want to start running, you know, a new Aurora databases. You want to migrate off of Oracle and go into Aurora. Okay, it's a common use case. Well, VMware is not in the business of running your Aurora database infrastructure. So, I mean, or if you want to have a Redshift cluster or anything like that. So by putting it into the customer account, you have full operation discretion about how you're going to operate this environment. And so connecting these accounts, technically connecting them, separate from a linking perspective, one of the things that we're going to do is, with your authorization in this customer account, there will be endpoints deployed into an account and a VPC instead of subnets that you designate. Now, why is that? Well, that's basically what's the plumbing that is going to enable the seamless integration between the two environments to operate. And I think it'll become pretty clear here in a bit. With it being inside of a customer account, you still maintain control. You still maintain operational control of those endpoints. And what I mean by that is you're not going to move them, you're not going to delete them and do things like that, but rather ACLs, security groups, policies, routing, everything, what hits that endpoint, you still have control over. And so as a result of that endpoint being available inside of your customer account, a workload that is running in VMware Cloud on AWS has the ability to consume native AWS services through these endpoints without having to go across the internet, without having to necessarily traverse a bunch of you know, VPNs or anything like that. It is meant to be localized routing. And so the access model, remember, it's delivered as a service. And so AWS will manage the physical infrastructure. So if we look at the shared responsibility model, we no longer are from the hypervisor to the dirt. We're from the equipment, the hardware to the dirt, because VMware has now been inserted. You know, they're a shim in between, if you would, that is managing from the hypervisor up through the deployment of the core infrastructure and the management of the core components. So that includes patching, that includes upgrading and monitoring the health of the environment and the operational health of the environment. And then the customer, you have your VMs and your networks that lay on top of that. And so if you start thinking about going through the ATO process, where you would just inherit an AWS package, and then everything above the hypervisor, you actually had to put your package together for. The modification there is that now VMware will be inserted with components, and there'll be package components to be inherited for an ATO as well. When we look at customer, you know, you can have access to the environment through vCenter and through the VMC portal, but there'll be some restrictions. So when you have access into the environment, you'll have no root access to the ESX host nodes. Remember, this is a managed service. So VMware is signing up for terms of service, support, uptime agreements, whatever it ends up being. They don't want people in messing around in the kernel on their nodes, right? So they're going to manage that. You don't have the ability to do that. So it does limit some of the things when you start getting into third-party integrations, but that's something that we're working with customers on. The VDS is the distributed switches. So the core, what I lazily call them the core plumbing components. So the wiring of these switches to, you know, mapping them to particular VLANs or whatever it may be, what you would traditionally do in your own environment, that's abstracted away from you as a customer. Those things, the distributed switches will be presented to you in an operating capacity. They'll be ready to operate both within the environment and through the connected account that you have with AWS. As a customer, you can now go in and you can now manage and carve up additional networks within those switches. You have that ability to do that, but actually changing the configuration, the core configuration of that switch has been abstracted away. And then the ESX edge, or I'm sorry, the NSX edge access, again, it'll be wired up for you. So the core components associated with that is abstracted away. But when you get into some of the advanced operating modes that we'll talk about here in a minute, You can start getting into the managing microservices and things like that, the NATing, the firewalling, and the load balancing. That stuff you can configure, but the actual changing the NSX edge, you're not going to have the ability to do that. And so really we're talking about two different operating modes for this. We have a simplified mode and an advanced mode. Simplified mode is pretty straightforward. It's really intended to be based off of a template. It has a set of predefined workflows that it's really meant to help get a customer up and running very quickly, to get the environment stood up and to be able to get in there and begin to operate. It's not meant to be terribly sophisticated. It's meant to be functional, to get you up and operating. So you can access many of the configuration items through the VMC portal, which is the same portal that you will use for the provisioning process and the subscription process and ordering process for this environment, but it's also an operating portal. Second to that, there's also, well, not necessarily second, but at the same time, you have vCenter. The HTML5 version of vCenter is going to be fully up and running and operational for you to connect to. And so you begin in a simplified mode, environment gets up and running, you kind of do the cookie cutter approach, everything gets hooked up for you, and you start consuming services slowly and do a slow ramp. There's the advanced mode where some of the things get swapped out, where we start getting the NSX. You're using the full NSX manager, having the ability to manage a little bit more or a lot more of NSX in the microsegmentation that can occur within that. Those services can be managed more closely by your administrators in your environment. And so if we get into the technical overview, let's look at the infrastructure. So the EC2 nodes that are being used for VMware Cloud are based off of our i3 instance family. And so we're presenting those to VMware. VMware is inserting ESX, so they're inserting their hypervisor, and then the provisioning process occurs from there through a very common or very familiar format. But if we take a look at the compute capacity, there's 36 physical cores, so 72 vCPUs per node, 512 gig of RAM, and 16 terabyte of NVMe flash storage per node. And so it's a minimum of a 4-node cluster. They are all dedicated hosts. So as we talk about going through compliance and separation of workloads and storage, if you talk to the folks from the Department of Defense, and you start getting into impact level 4, impact level 5. Impact level 4, definitely. Impact level 5, the conversation changes a bit because, well, now this is dedicated storage. You're not sharing any of it with anybody. You're not using a shared common fabric, storage fabric to store your data. And so it opens up a lot of things on that front. If we look at things from a storage perspective, I talked about it. The familiar part of this is the ESX kernel will be booted from EBS, but that's the only piece that runs on EBS. All of the storage is on the 16 terabytes of solid-state storage per node operating within vSAN. We get into vSphere, you'll have the latest features. Latest features of the software will be deployed into the environment. So things like HA, vMotion, DRS, those are all embedded and part of the solution as it launches. And so at a minimum, when the solution launches, vMotioning across these nodes and within this cluster, not a problem. Eventually, it would be vMotioning from offsite, from your premise, your data center, into the cloud-based data center. So the intention here is to have all of this all interoperating just as if it was seamlessly on-prem. Elastic DRS. The thought here is around DRS. Well, with your traditional resource scheduler, you can set your high water marks, have your alarmings and things like that occur for your cluster. But if you think of things with an elastic DRS, you're now operating on an elastic infrastructure. Elastic in the sense that if you need more compute, you can get more compute. And so the plan and the thought here is that very similar to the way you would operate an auto-scaling group, a cluster of servers that are operating inside of an auto-scaling group, you would do this but for a vCenter deployment. So if your DRS cluster starts running hot and you need to rebalance and you need additional nodes, it's no longer days to weeks to months to get additional hardware into your racks. It's minutes to provision a new cluster with 72 cores. and the specs that we have up there. And so from the thought from an elastic DRS perspective is take some of the elements of an auto-scaling type of capability and take advantage of that elasticity and program that into DRS. And let DRS be the intelligent source of what should happen and what shouldn't happen in the environment. If we look at the networking, very robust networking capabilities for these instances, these host nodes. We show 10 plus gig. It's definitely 10 plus. I'll leave it at that. The interoperability between these nodes is functioning at a very high throughput. So I don't see network bandwidth or even compute for that matter to really be a restriction. In fact, talking to some of my VMware colleagues just recently, and I think they actually even published it on Twitter, had done a large-scale provisioning of 1,000 VMs onto a 4-node cluster. So did a provisioning and a boot storm, and the cluster handled it without any problem. So we're talking some pretty high throughput and pretty highly capable machines here. So if we look at the SAN, vSAN storage, it's VMware's vSAN solution. This will be largely configured for you. There's some discussion about whether or not you can get into the RAID levels. I don't think there's going to be a lot of wiggle room around that. Probably RAID 5 or RAID 6 with dedupe, but that's in the realm of what you're going to be doing. So what does that really mean? Well, you're running your storage on host. It's not EBS backed. And so you have to deal with the replication of the data and making sure that you have the appropriate copies and you can deal with node failures. This is what vSAN's doing for you. That's built into the core capability of vSAN. We talk about NSX, so this SDDC platform for VMware, correct? So you say, okay, so we have SDDC, so we have NSX running inside of VPC, and then you have virtual. It gets to be a really kind of a complex picture. I'll just throw it up there. That's what we're talking about. The very bottom of the picture is your VPC underlay network. You have your ESX host nodes, lay the VMware ESX hypervisor on top of those, and then NSX, vSAN, and everything takes off from there, from that point forward. So let's get into the drill down. So we start with our existing customer environment. It's a mix, virtual environment, perhaps private cloud. You have your virtual data centers, and then you have a mix of physical infrastructure there as well. You do not have a requirement to be running NSX on-prem to be able to connect to and operate with this environment. In fact, if you don't have that environment, you have that in place, you can use a standalone NSX edge node that you can deploy on-prem to enable you to activate, if you would, some of the higher level functions to interoperate between the environments. But that's not even a requirement. You could just do connectivity directly from your network using any host of VPN connections or whatever it may be. You have a lot of options and a lot of discretion at this point. When you get into the provisioning process, we talked about it. So as a customer, you have your VMware account. You go into the VMware portal. You make a request to build an infrastructure. So you select the size of your cluster. Let's say it's a 4-node cluster. At that point, the provisioning process will occur. A new account is created. VPC is created, all fully automated. The ESX nodes were stood up. They are auto-provisioned in a single tenant account that is still owned and operated by VMware. So I had a very good question last week at a customer conference. Customer said, I use a third-party partner of yours to manage all of my account billings. Will I be able to see my spend, my AWS spend for this account? And the answer is no. This is a VMware account. VMware can see all the spend for the account. They'll definitely be seeing that. But as a customer, you're not going to be able to go into your AWS console and then pull it up and select a data center and say, oh, let me see my EC2 spend. That's not going to be able to happen. It's not happening. We get into provisioning your customer-owned VPC. So again, this can be in an existing account that you have today, you're already using. It doesn't have to be a brand new one. Because ultimately what we're doing is deploying endpoints into whatever account you designate that ultimately appear as network adapters on whatever subnet you designate. And so the next thing is you want to connect back to your customer data center to the VPCs. And so we have a couple different options here. Early stages may be, hey, we're just going to do VPN connections. But for purposes of this discussion, we're going to talk about Direct Connect. And so from a private connectivity perspective, you can do a Direct Connect from your location directly to the account that you have. Maybe you already have one in place. I mean, it doesn't have to be a new one, right? You can have this connectivity to your account. You fully own and manage that. Remember, we're talking about compliance? You manage the transit. You manage the circuits. You're managing everything associated with connecting to this environment. So there's further demonstration that you have control there as you're going through certifications. Now, how do we connect to the VMware piece? Well, been a lot of back and forth on the engineering pieces of this, and we said, well, one of the things we could do is, if you have a Direct Connect, you can provision a secondary private virtual interface, host it off of your Direct Connect, but just designate and target that private interface to be connected to the VMware account. And so your cluster management and your vMotion traffic can flow across that connection directly into VMware. This is not the only design pattern, just an FYI. There are other ways to deal with this. This just happens to be the one that I chose for this. And so once this occurs, you're going to do the linking between the accounts. So you can designate a subnet, it can be an existing subnet or a new subnet, and the endpoints will be connected into your VPC. Again, these are, for all intents and purposes, as a customer, when you're looking into your AWS account and your operators are looking at the network, they'll see network interfaces in their account, and they'll manage them, right? So all the things that you would do is if you were standing up an EC2 node in your environment, you would want to manage that as well. And so once these accounts are linked up, you may already have, or you may want to, you can consume any of the native AWS services of your choice. Or you can just have the account set up, linked, and not deploy a single AWS service. Just have that be just designated only to support the VMware Cloud on AWS deployment. And so if we look at the use cases, and we get into doing an vMotion from on-site out to the cloud, we'll take a look at what that looks like. And then if you have a workload that's running in VMware Cloud, how do you get to S3? What's the path? So we'll talk about that. We get into connecting to any of our managed services. I just happen to pick Redshift. It could be Aurora DB. It could be anything. And then what if you want to go from outside in? You want to source your traffic from the internet and be able to access a VM or a resource that's running inside of VMware. And so if we go back to our map and take a look at this, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a VM that's on-site that we want to put out into the VMware Cloud. The path that it'll follow is pretty straightforward. It is literally just, as you're leaving your VLAN, or when you're looking at Direct Connect, what have you done? You've basically designated a set of VLANs. This is just a VLAN you're pumping the traffic out to. It's hitting the virtual private gateway within the VMware account, and it is actually routing that traffic directly to the ESX fabric. And so your vMotion happens just the way you would if you were running it within a single site or within a collection of sites within a physical data center. It's not a new interface. It's not this plugin that you have to add to your ecosystem or anything like that. It's still the same vMotion, vStorage motion type movement, same muscle movement. As we get into S3, so if we take that VM that we just moved out to the cloud and we say, okay, we either want to put or fetch objects from S3, the path that we would follow through the endpoint, you can route through the VPC and directly through a VPC private endpoint to S3. So your packets never have to go out to the public internet. Now, the question becomes, well, why not just put an endpoint inside of the VMware VPC? You certainly could do that, but as many people will recognize, especially in an AWS crowd, fetching and retrieving an object it's not free, right? It's metered. It's metered access. And so if you put that endpoint onto the VMware account, now VMware has a new responsibility in addition to operating your environment. They have to actually do the billing as well for your traffic. And so there's a lot of discussion about how's the best way to handle that. But from a technical implementation, this is just standard technology being bolted in place using standard practices. So Redshift, if we want to connect to Redshift, if you want to outsource your your data warehouse capabilities from running, consuming a lot of resources on your cluster, and you want to move to a managed mode. Again, the path is very similar. Flow through the endpoints and hit the published endpoints for the managed service. Now, the internet access is one that there's a bunch of different permutations you could take with this one. And it really depends. I mean, actually, the illustration I have here is if I look at my former customers with the DoD, it wouldn't even be within the realm of possibility, just because of the way that the policy is written. But if you were to source the traffic from the internet trying to hit a VM here, you would connect to that. You would assign an elastic IP similar to how you would normally within VMware. So if you want to source traffic from the public internet and hit a resource running in your VPC, assign an elastic IP. Well, the difference here is you would actually assign those elastic IPs to your VMware Cloud endpoint. And then the traffic will be sourced from the internet through your internet gateway, hit the endpoint, and at that point, you're now communicating with an NSX edge node. And the edge node will take care of any NATing, any firewall rules, or anything associated with the action that you just configured. Now, if I was to diverge a little bit from this and say, well, what if we're talking about if you're going through ticks or you're going through caps or anything like that associated with the other customers, instead of the traffic being sourced there, it's still going to come through your IAPs, flow through your network. It would just come across the direct connect, same traffic pattern. I mean, it would, you wouldn't need the elastic IP because you could use the routing to the IPs that you have today. Basically, it's the same configuration that you use today to route packets to a workload running inside of AWS, but having to flow through an IAP through the cap and hit it. So it's the same connectivity option. So we get into security and governance. The endpoints live inside of your customer account. So you have control of those endpoints. So if you need to shut flow off, if you need to stop packets from coming in or going out, you have control of that. Again, with compliance in mind, this is why a big driver for why this architecture has been built this way, because we've got to be able to create demarcs. We've got to be able to have handoffs and demonstrate them, because ultimately, you're going to need to accredit these workloads. You're going to be able to demonstrate controls. You're going to need to demonstrate who has areas of responsibility. And so when you look at the endpoints as being inside of your customer account, you have full control over the packets that flow to and from. When you get into the transit path, so I talked a little bit about using direct connect, or you could use a VPN tunnel, whatever it is. From an operations and governance perspective, you control the transit path. So if you start out small and say, I want to do VPN just to get things up and running, and you do that, and you decide, all right, it's time to cut over to direct connect, you can do that, and you don't have to engage. It's likely that you would want to engage VMware and VMware support to let them know that you're changing the transit path, but there's really no uplift for them. There's nothing that they have to do, because you're just swapping it out, right? You're just going to connect to the same gateway that they're publishing and making available to you to connect to. So you have options there. The vMotion traffic in 6.5 is encrypted. So the vMotion traffic is not going to be in the clear. So we have that working for us. And then you also get the VM level encryption, so inside of the data stores. It's an option for you. So when we get into the logging, and this is particularly important, especially for our customers that have to deal with compliance regimes. So you guys already are mostly aware, or I would imagine very aware of what our logging capabilities are on the AWS platform natively. Between CloudWatch, with CloudTrail monitoring all the API calls, you have flow logging within the VPC, and you have the individual logging that may occur within the resource that you deploy in the environment. Well, you have the audit quality logging here that has attribution of whatever events occurred on the VMware platform is also now being made available. And so if you start taking all those different log sources and you combine them, you have a pretty solid record with attribution of what is happening in your environment, whether it's AWS or it's VMware or both. You have full visibility into that. Those are your logs. You can manage and consume them as you see fit. And again, this is fully managed offering from VMware. And so when you think about it from an operations and governance perspective, you're basically consuming platform as a service. And so you have to build that into your operational model. From a management, as far as an underlying infrastructure management, managing the nodes, managing the underlay networks and the connectivity to those networks, all of that's going to be done by VMware. The patching, that's going to be done by VMware. So there's going to be a coordination between your operations teams and VMware that's going to be required. All the updating, all the patching of the hypervisors is done by VMware. And an interesting note about that is that if you subscribe to a node of X size, so 4 nodes, and you have to take, because of patching and maintenance activities, a node needs to go offline, the plan with VMware is to actually insert another node into the cluster to make sure you maintain what you have subscribed to from a capacity perspective and can take offline the other nodes for maintenance. So as a customer, you should see a steady and consistent resource pool for you. So you don't have to, it changes your thinking a bit when you start talking about your strategy around, do you do oversubscription? How heavily do you subscribe your workloads in the VMware clusters, right? Before maybe you had a 20 or 30% reserve because you had to absorb node failure. Well, maybe you change that. I'm not saying it goes to 0, but I don't think it necessarily has to stay at the same number as it was before. Maybe it's half, right? Because if you can bring a new ESX node online within minutes as opposed to days, then you can pretty quickly stratify your workloads that, okay, if we have a workload that goes down because we don't have enough resource for 15 minutes, we can survive that because it fits cleanly into our RTO. Just as a thought. So it changes your discussion around that. And I talked about the infrastructure patching. Right now, we have early access programs have kicked off. We actually have customers in beta mode now that are on the platform and operating. This has been underway and will be for some time. We have enlisted a lot of customers here. We had a lot of demand. In fact, for our beta program, there was over 1,000 requests to be part of the beta, and we had less than 100 slots to give out. A lot of demand. So as a result, we're getting a lot of, and I really anticipate that we'll get some pretty straightforward, very brutally honest feedback from the customers, and that's what we want. Because the goal here is to roll this out globally. VMware will make a determination as to which regions will sequence, but one of the next regions that we are planning and we have active work underway with is to go into GovCloud, to make this available into GovCloud, and we are actively working in a joint capacity between the two companies to accelerate the accreditation process. We're seeking to attain FedRAMP certification, and then we will go after with whatever agency requires higher levels, so if DoD or whatever, we'll seek to attain the additional accreditations and certifications on here. The bottom line with that is we want it to be a fast follow, not an 18-month laggard, because we recognize that the public sector is amongst some of the largest customers that VMware has in its portfolio. And we want to be able to make this available to those customers, to you guys, to make them available to immediately start consuming this without having to wait 3 years. So with that, my screen went black. Perfect, that was my last slide. Thanks, everybody. I'll be available for questions. My colleague from VMware is also here as well. I have some questions, and then we may have to move outside because there's another presentation that's going to be starting. Thanks, everybody.